Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jeffrey Epstein Show. I'm your host, Bobby Capucci, and it's great to have you guys on board. So today you're used to the long-form show, the 1-hour show where Lee and I go back and we wrap up everything and we talk about what went on during the week, and we listen to Lee give us a few of his opinions, and it's always a good time. But Lee is a little caught up in some other things this week, so instead what I have for you is a new segment that we're starting to work on, and today will be the first episode of it. It's called A Closer Look. And in these segments, we're going to take a closer look at all the people that were wrapped up in the Epstein circle, all of his closest confidants, everybody who was in his gravity pretty much, everyone who was very close to him, who had anything to do with his personal life. We're going to take a closer look at them. And in today's episode, we're going to start with a group that I've touched on a few times in podcasts prior, and that is the Mega Group. And what we're going to do here is we're going to go to an article that was written by Whitney Webb back at Mint Press News all the way in August of this year. And this is an article that should be in the mainstream media. This is an article that should be reported on heavily. This is an article that unpacks a lot of information and gives us, or you, people who are interested in this topic, different things to explore, things you don't hear in the news. And what you should do is explore these things that you hear on these shows like my podcast, or you read in articles like Whitney's. Explore the things that you read and do the research for yourself and see if they're factual. And then say to yourself, why is the mainstream media lying to me? What do they have to gain by lying to me? And it's much deeper than just this case. It goes into the two-tier justice system, and it's deep. They have so many chips in the game that lying to us is essential at this point for the mainstream media, for them to keep their narrative going. And to be frank with you, I'm tired of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into this is a very long article. We're going to jump into this article, and I'll have some commentary, and we'll explore it together. As billionaire pedophile and alleged sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein sits in prison, reports have continued to surface about his reported links to intelligence, his financial ties to several companies and charitable foundations, and his friendships with rich and powerful as well as top politicians. While Part 1 and Part 2 of this series, the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, Too Big to Fail, have focused on the widespread nature of sexual blackmail operations in recent American history and their ties to the heights of American political power and the U.S. intelligence community, one key aspect of Epstein's own sex trafficking and blackmail operation that warrants examination is Epstein's ties to Israeli intelligence and his ties to the informal pro-Israel philanthropist faction known as the Mega Group. The Mega Group's role in the Epstein case has garnered some attention as Epstein's main financial patrons for decades, billionaire Leslie Wexner was a co-founder of the group that unites several well-known businessmen with a penchant for pro-Israel and ethno-philanthropy. However, as this report will show, another uniting factor among Mega Group members is deep ties to organized crime, specifically the organized crime network discussed in Part 1 of this series, which was largely led by notorious American mobster Meyer Lansky. By virtue of the role of many Mega Group members as major political donors in both the U.S. and Israel, several of its most notable members have close ties to the governments of both countries as well as their intelligence communities. As this report and a subsequent report will show, the Mega Group also had close ties to two businessmen who worked for Israel's Mossad, Robert Maxwell and Mark Rich, as well as top Israeli politicians, including past and present prime ministers with deep ties to Israel's intelligence community. One of those businessmen working for the Mossad, Robert Maxwell, will be discussed at length in this report. Maxwell, who was a business partner of Mega Group co-founder Charles Bronfman, aided the successful Mossad plot to plant a trapdoor in U.S.-created software that was then sold to governments and companies throughout the world. That plot's success was largely due to the role of a close associate of then-President Ronald Reagan and an American politician close to Maxwell, who later helped aid Reagan in the cover-up of the Iran-Contra scandal. Years later, Maxwell's daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, would join Jeffrey Epstein's inner circle. At the same time, Epstein was bankrolling a similar software program now being marketed for critical electronic infrastructure in the U.S. and abroad. That company has deep and troubling connections to Israeli military intelligence, associates of the Trump administration, and the Mega Group. Epstein appears to have ties to Israeli intelligence and has well-documented ties to influential Israeli politicians and the mega group. Yet, those entities are not isolated in and of themselves, as many also connect the organized crime network and powerful alleged pedophiles discussed in previous installments of this series. Perhaps the best illustration of how the connections between many of these players often meld together can be seen in Ronald Lauder, a megagroup member, former member of Reagan's administration, a longtime donor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's Likud party, as well as longtime friend of Donald Trump and Roy Cohn. From cosmetics heir to political player. One often overlooked yet famous client and friend of Roy Cohn is the billionaire heir to the Estee Lauder cosmetics fortune, Ronald Lauder. Lauder is often described in the press as a leading Jewish donor and the president of the World Jewish Congress, yet his many media profiles tend to leave out his highly political past. In a statement given by Lauder to New York Times reporter Maggie Haberman in 2018, the cosmetic heir noted that he has known Trump for over 50 years, going back at least to the early 1970s. According to Lauder, his relationship with Trump began when Trump was a student at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, which Lauder also attended. Though the exact nature of their early friendship is unclear, it is evident that they shared many of the same connections, including to the man who would later count them both as his clients, Roy Cohn. While much has been said of the ties between Cohn and Trump, Cohn was particularly close to Lauder's mother, Estee Lauder, born Josephine Menser. Estee was even counted among Cohn's most high-profile friends in his New York Times obituary. A small window into the Lauder-Cohn relationship surfaced briefly in a 2016 article in Politico about a 1991 dinner party held at Cohn's weekend home in Greenwich, Connecticut. The party was attended by Ronald Lauder's parents, Estee and Joe, as well as Trump and his then-wife Ivana, who had a weekend home just 2 miles away. That party was held soon after Cohn had helped Reagan secure the presidency and had reached the height of his political influence. At the party, Cohn offered toasts to Reagan and to then Senator for New York Alphonse D'Amato, who would later urge Ronald Lauder to run for political office. 2 years later, in 1983, Ronald Lauder, whose only professional experience at that point was working for his parents' cosmetics company, was appointed to serve as United States Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO Affairs. Soon after his appointment, he served on the Dinner Tribute Committee for a dinner hosted by the Jewish Fraternal and Strongly Pro-Israel organization, I cannot pronounce that word, BNAIBRITH, the parent organization of the controversial Anti-Defamation League, in Roy Cohn's honor. Cohn's influential father, Albert Cohn, and longtime president of B'nai B'rith, powerful New England, New York chapter, and Roy Cohn himself was a member of B'nai B'rith's Banking and Finance Lodge. The dinner specifically sought to honor Cohn for his pro-Israel advocacy and his efforts to fortify Israel's economy, and its honorary chairman, including media mogul Rupert Murdoch, Donald Trump, and then head of Bear Stearns, Alan Greenberg, all of whom are connected to Jeffrey Epstein. During his time as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Lauder was also very active in Israeli politics and had already become an ally of then Israeli representative to the United Nations and future Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. Lauder would go on to be one of the most important individuals in Netanyahu's rise to power, particularly during his upset victory in 1996 and a major financier of Israel's right-wing Likud party. In 1986, the year that Roy Cohn died, Lauder left his post at the Pentagon and he became the U.S. ambassador to Austria, where his tenure was shaped by his confrontations with the then Austrian president and former Nazi collaborator Kurt Waldheim. Lauder's interest in Austrian politics has continued well into recent years, culminating in accusations that he sought to manipulate Austrian elections in 2012. After leaving his ambassadorship, Lauder founded the Ronald S. Lauder Foundation in 1987 and later went on to run for mayor of New York against Rudy Giuliani in 1989. Lauder was encouraged to run by then-Senator Alphonse D'Amato, who had close ties to Roy Cohn, and his longtime partner Tom Bolin, who was D'Amato's advisor. At the aforementioned 1983 B'nai B'rith dinner honoring Cohn, D'Amato was the featured speaker. The likely reason was that Giuliani, though once an ally of the Roy Cohn machine, was at the time deeply disliked by the late Cohn associates for prosecuting Cohn's former law partner, Stanley Friedman, for racketeering, conspiracy, and other charges. Giuliani also had a history of bitter disagreements with D'Amato. Lauder's primary campaign, though unsuccessful, was noted for its viciousness and its cost as it burned through more than $13 million. A few years later, in the early 1990s, Lauder would join a newly formed group that has long evaded scrutiny from the media, but has recently become of interest in connection with the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, the Mega Group. All right, so let's pause here for a second and talk about this. She goes into a lot there. The Iran-Contra scandal, some of the people that were in Reagan's atmosphere and orbit who weren't good people, and it's just a fact. You know, there was a lot of bad stuff going on in this government for a long time before Trump showed up, and there's a lot of bad stuff still going on, and Trump's not immune from it, and neither is his cabinet. As I've always said on this show, I will follow the evidence wherever it leads me. And I haven't read too many of these big articles from Whitney Webb because I was independently verifying things in these articles before I shared them with you, my audience. Because I think it's very important that I'm very upfront and honest with you guys when something's my opinion, or when something is vetted or isn't vetted, or when it's just an article that maybe is questionable. But Whitney Webb has been very, very reliable up to this point. She does very good research, and I know that there are people that listen to the show that are pro-Trump, just like there are people that listen to the show that are pro-Democrat. And sometimes things are uncomfortable, but we have to follow the evidence in this case wherever it may lead us, and that's what we're going to do. I've promised you guys that from the very beginning. For the people that are here from the very beginning, I know you want to expose the disgustingness at the very top the same way I do, and it doesn't matter who's involved. All right, so back to the article. Lauder, Epstein, and the mysterious Austrian passport. Before getting to the Mega Group, it is worth noting one particular act apparently undertaken by Lauder while he was a U.S. ambassador to Austria that has recently come to light in relation to the arrest in early July of Jeffrey Epstein, a finding first reported by journalist Edward Zoll. When police recently discovered an Austrian passport with Epstein's picture and a fake name after raiding his Manhattan residence, the source and purpose of the passport came under media scrutiny. Okay, we got to pause for a second and talk about that. That's another thing I've talked about several times about him being an asset. Now he has an Austrian passport as well as a Saudi passport. Normal people don't get that sort of thing. He's obviously connected to intelligence one way or the other, but the media refuses to report on this. And if you do report on stuff like this, you're a conspiracy theorist. Yet you have Hillary Clinton and mainstream media talking about how Tulsi Gabbard is a Russian agent and Jill Stein is a Russian agent. She don't have receipts for any of that. She's just firing off from the hip. You want to talk about conspiracy theories? That's a conspiracy theory. What we're dealing with here, folks, this is a cover-up. According to the Associated Press, Epstein's defense lawyers specifically argued that a friend gave it to him in the 1980s after some Jewish Americans were informally advised to carry identification bearing a non-Jewish name when traveling internationally during a period when hijackings were more common. Oh, bupkis. This claim appears to be related to the concerns that followed the hijacking of Air France Flight 139 in 1976 when Israeli and Jewish hostages were separated from the other hostages based largely on the passports in their possession. Given that Epstein was unable to meet the conventional qualifications for an Austrian passport, including long-term residency in Austria, the passport lists him as a resident of Saudi Arabia, and fluency in German, it appears that the only way to have acquired an Austrian passport was by unconventional means, meaning assistance from a well-connected Austrian official or foreign diplomat with clout in Austria. Lauder, then ambassador to Austria for the Reagan administration, would have been well positioned to acquire such a passport, particularly for the reason cited by Epstein's attorneys that Jewish Americans could be targeted during travel and in light of Lauder's very public concerns over threats Jews face from certain terror groups. Furthermore, the passport had been issued in 1987 when Lauder was still serving as an ambassador. In addition, Lauder was well connected to Epstein's former patron, former head of Bear Stearns, Alan Greenberg, who had hired Epstein in the late 70s immediately after the latter was fired from the Dalton School, and Donald Trump, another friend of Lauder and Greenberg, who began his friendship with Epstein in 1987, the same year the fake Austrian passport was issued. In 1987, Epstein also began his relationship with his principal financier, Leslie Wexner, who is also closely associated with the Lauder, though some sources claim that Epstein and Wexner first met in 1985, but that their strong business relationship was not established until 1987. Though Epstein's defense attorney declined to reveal the identity of the friend who provided him with the fake Austrian passport, Lauder was both well positioned to acquire it in Austria and also deeply connected to the Mega Group, which also co-founded by Epstein's patron Leslie Wexner, and to which Epstein has many connections. These connections to both the Austrian government and to Epstein's mentor make Lauder the most likely person to have acquired the document on Epstein's behalf. Furthermore, Epstein and the Mega Group ties to the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad also suggest Lauder was involved in procuring the passport in light of his close ties to the Israeli government and the fact that the Mossad has a history of using ambassadors abroad to procure false foreign passports for its operatives. Lauder himself has been alleged to have ties to the Mossad, as he is a longtime funder of IDC Herzliya, an Israeli university closely associated with the Mossad and their recruiters, as well as Israeli military intelligence. Lauder even founded IDC Herzliya Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy. Now, the part about military intelligence is very important. As we reported earlier, what the drop about Ben Amash, when he was talking about how they were both owned, Maxwell and Epstein, by Israeli military intelligence. So once again, this is just more evidence leading into that and proving what we're going on here. Furthermore, Lauder co-founded the Eastern European Broadcasting Network, CETV, with Mark Palmer, a former U.S. diplomat, Kissinger aide, and Reagan speechwriter. Palmer is better known for co-founding the National Endowment for Democracy, an organization often described as an accessory to U.S. intelligence, and one whose first president confessed to the Washington Post that a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. A 2001 report in the Evening Standard noted that Epstein once claimed that during the 1980s he worked for the CIA, but later Epstein backed away from that assertion. So we covered that as well in the drop about the headlines that were scrubbed out of the papers. So once again, more evidence. The origins of the Mega Group Mafia. The Mega Group, a secretive group of billionaires to which Lauder belongs, was formed in 1991 by Charles Bronfman and Leslie Wexner, the latter of whom has received considerable media scrutiny following the July arrest of his former protege, Jeffrey Epstein. Media profiles of the group paint it as a loosely organized club of 20 of the nation's wealthiest and most influential Jewish businessmen, focused on philanthropy and Jewishness, with memberships dues upwards of $30,000 per year. Yet several of its most prominent members have ties to organized crime. Mega Group members founded and or are closely associated with some of the most well-known pro-Israel organizations. For instance, members Charles Bronfman and Michael Steinhardt formed Birthright Taglit with the backing of then and current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Steinhardt, an atheist, has stated that his motivation in helping to found the group was to advance his own belief that devotion to and faith in the State of Israel should serve as a substitute for Jewish theology. Okay, so just that comment alone just goes to show you that these people aren't interested in the Jewish faith. They use Israel and Zionism as something completely different. Because anyone who knows me understands that the state of Israel and the idea of Israel is something I'm very pro. I'm very pro-Israel in that regard. Because I understand that region a lot more than most people do. I understand the history around that region. I understand what's going on over there. And I understand that Israel deserves to have a piece of land to call their own, their own, especially a piece of land that has been in Jewish hands for a very long time, and that's for a whole different debate. But my point is here, this isn't, I'm not, and she's not even trying to be anti-Semitic or anything like that. But sometimes the facts are uncomfortable, but we have to follow them wherever they go, or else we're just like the mainstream media, and we're just reporting on what we want to report on, and that's not what I'm doing here. Back to the article. Other well-known groups associated with the mega group include the World Jewish Congress, whose past president, Edgar Bronfman, and current president, Ronald Lauder, are both mega group members. Its spin-off, known as the Anti-Defamation League, and B'nai B'rith, particularly its spin-off, known as the Anti-Defamation League. The Bronfman brothers were major donors to the ADL, with Edgar Bronfman serving as the ADL's honorary national vice chair for several years. When Edgar Bronfman died in 2013, longtime ADL director Abe Foxman said, "Edgar was for many years chair of our liquor industry division, chair of our New York appeal, and one of our most significant benefactors." Other megagroup members that are donors and major supporters of the ADL include Ronald Lauder, Michael Steinhardt, and the late Max Fisher. As previously mentioned, Roy Cohn's father was a longtime leader of B'nai B'rith's influential New England, New York chapter, and Cohn was a later celebrated member of its banking and finance lodge. In addition, megagroup members have also been key players in the pro-Israel lobby in the United States. For instance, Max Fisher of the megagroup founded the National Jewish Coalition, now known as the Republican Jewish Coalition, the main pro-Israel neoconservative political lobbying group, known for its support of hawkish policies, and whose current chief patron, Sheldon Adelson and Bernard Marcus, are among Donald Trump's top donors. Though the megagroup has officially existed only since 1991, the use of philanthropy to provide cover for more unscrupulous lobbying or business activities was pioneered decades earlier by Sam Bronfman, the father of the megagroup members Edgar and Charles Bronfman. While other North American elites like J.D. Rockefeller had previously used charitable giving as a means of laundering their reputation, Bronfman approach charity was unique because it was focused on giving specifically to other members of his own ethno-religious background. Sam Bronfman, as was detailed in part 1 of this series, had a long-standing deep tie to organized crime, specifically Meyer Lansky's organized crime syndicate. Yet Bronfman's private ambition, according to those close to him, was to become a respected member of high society. As a consequence, Bronfman worked hard to remove the stain that his mob associations had left on his public reputation in Canada and abroad. He accomplished this by becoming a leader in Canada's Zionist movement. By the end of the 1930s, he was head of the Canadian Jewish Congress and had begun to make a name for himself as a giver to Jewish causes. Yet even some of Bronfman's activism had hints of the mobster-like reputation he tried so hard to shake. For instance, Bronfman was actively involved in the illegal shipping of arms to Zionist paramilitaries in Palestine prior to 1948, specifically as a co-founder of the National Conference for Israeli and Jewish Rehabilitation that smuggled weapons to the paramilitary group Haganah. At the same time, Bronfman was abetting the illegal smuggling of weapons to the Haganah. His associates in the criminal underworld were doing the same. After World War II, close aides of David Ben-Gurion, who would later become the first prime minister of Israel and was instrumental in the founding of the Mossad, forged a tight-knit relationship with Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Mickey Cohen, and other Jewish gangsters of the period. They used their clandestine networks to establish a vast arms smuggling network between the United States and Zionist settlements in Palestine, arming both the Haganah and the Irgun paramilitary groups. As noted in part 1 of this report, at the same time these gangsters were aiding the illegal arming of Zionist paramilitaries, they were strengthening their ties to the U.S. intelligence and had been formally, though covertly, established in World War II. After Israel was founded, Sam Bronfman worked with future Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres to negotiate the sale of Canadian armaments at half price to Israel, and the bargain weapon purchase was paid for entirely by a fundraising dinner hosted by Bronfman and his wife. Many years later, Peres would go on to introduce another future Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, to Jeffrey Epstein. The rest of the Bronfman's family march on the road of respectability was undertaken by Bronfman's children, who married into Aristocrat families, such as the European Rothschilds and the Wall Street royalty of the Lehmans and the Loebs. The Bronfmans' newfound respectability did not mean that their association with the Lansky-led criminal empire had dissolved. Indeed, prominent members of the Seagram's dynasty came under fire in the 60s and 70s for their close association with Willie Obie O'Brant, a major figure in Canadian organized crime who Canadian professor Stephen Schneider has referred to as the Meyer Lansky of Canada. However, Edgar and Charles Bronfman were hardly the only members of the megagroup with deep and long-standing ties to the Lansky-led National Crime Syndicate. Indeed, one of the group's prominent members, hedge fund manager Michael Steinhardt, opened up about his own family ties to Lansky in his autobiography, No Bull, My Life in and Out of the Markets, where he noted that his father, Saul Red McGee Steinhardt, was Lansky's jewel fence of choice and a major player in New York's criminal underworld. Saul Steinhardt was also his son's first client on Wall Street and helped him jumpstart his career in finance. The ties between the megagroup and the National Crime Syndicate don't stop there. Another prominent member of the megagroup with ties to the same criminal network is Max Fisher, who has been described as Wexner's mentor and is also alleged to have worked with Detroit's Purple Gang during Prohibition and beyond. The Purple Gang were part of the network that smuggled Bronfman liquor from Canada into the United States during Prohibition, and one of its founders, Abe Bernstein, was a close associate of both Meyer Lansky and Moe Dalitz. Fisher was a key advisor to several U.S. presidents, beginning with Dwight D. Eisenhower as well as to Henry D. Kissinger. In addition to Fisher, megagroup member Ron Lauder was connected to Roy Cohn and Tom Bolin, both of whom were closely associated with the same Lansky-led crime network and who represented top mafia figures in court. Furthermore, another member of the megagroup, director Steven Spielberg, is a well-known protege of Lew Wasserman, the mob-connected media mogul and longtime backer of Ronald Reagan's film and later political career, discussed in Part 2 of this series. One surprise connection to Cohn involves megagroup member and former president of U.S. weapons firm General Dynamics, Lester Crown, whose brother-in-law is David Schein, Cohn's confidant and alleged lover during the McCarthy hearings, whose relationship with Cohn helped bring about the downfall of McCarthyism. Another member of the megagroup worth noting is Lawrence Tisch, who owned CBS for several years and founded Lowe's Corporation. Tisch is notable for his work for the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, where Donald Barr, who hired Epstein at the Dalton School, also served and which forged ties with Lansky's criminal empire during World War II. Wexner's mansion and the Shapiro murder. Leslie, Lex Wexner, and the other megagroup founders also has ties to organized crime. Wexner's ties to Jeffrey Epstein have come under scrutiny following the latter's recent arrest, as Wexner was the only publicly acknowledged client of Epstein's suspicious hedge fund, the source of much of this wealth, and the previous owner of Epstein's $56 million Manhattan townhouse, which Wexner transferred to Epstein Control Entity for free. Before Epstein received the townhouse, Wexner appears to have used the residence for some unconventional purposes, noted in a 1996 New York Times article on the then Wexner-owned residence, which included a bathroom reminiscent of James Bond movies, hidden beneath a stairway lined with lead to provide shelter from attack, and supplied with closed-circuit television screens and a telephone, both concealed in a cabinet beneath the sink. The Times article does not speculate as to the purpose of the equipment, though the allusion to famous fictional super spy James Bond suggests that it may have been used to snoop on guests or conduct electronic surveillances. Well, we know Epstein used it for that when he took over the place. That's a given. We have that on record. So I'm pretty confident saying that was going on. So the 1996 Times article also noted that after Wexner bought the residence for $13.2 million in 1989, he spent millions more decorating and furnishing the home, including the addition of the electronic equipment in the James Bond bathroom, only to apparently never live in it. The Times, which interviewed Epstein for the piece, quoted him as saying that Les never spent more than 2 months there. Epstein told the Times, which identified Epstein as Wexner's protege and one of his financial advisors, that the house, by that time, already belonged to him. That same year, Epstein was commissioning artwork for Wexner's Ohio mansion, a recent article from the Times noted. In the summer of 1996, Maria Farmer was working on an art project for Mr. Epstein in Mr. Wexner's Ohio mansion. While she was there, Mr. Epstein sexually assaulted her, according to an affidavit Miss Farmer filed earlier this year in federal court in Manhattan. She said that she fled the room and called the police, but Mr. Wexner's security staff refused to let her leave for 12 hours. Farmer's account strongly suggests that given the behavior of his personal security staff at his mansion following Epstein's alleged assault on Farmer, Wexner was well aware of Epstein's predatory behavior towards young women. This is compounded by claims made by Alan Dershowitz, a former lawyer for and friend of Epstein's, who has also been accused of raping underage girls, that Wexner has also been accused of raping underage girls exploited by Epstein on at least 7 occasions. The presence of electronic equipment in his home's bathroom, other oddities related to the townhouse, and aspects of the links between Epstein and Wexner suggest there is more to Wexner, who has rather successfully developed a public image of a respectable businessman, much like other prominent members of the mega group. However, bits and pieces of Wexner's private secrets have occasionally bubbled up, only to be subjected to rapid cover-ups amidst concern of libeling the powerful and well-connected billionaire. The well-connected billionaire. In 1985, Columbus, Ohio lawyer Arthur Shapiro was murdered in broad daylight at point-blank range in what was largely referred to as a mob-style murder. The homicide still remains unsolved, likely due to the fact that then Columbus Police Chief James Jackson ordered the destruction of key documents of his department's investigation into the murder. Jackson's ordering of the document's destruction came to light years later in 1996 when he was under investigation for corruption. According to the Columbus Dispatch, Jackson justified the destruction of one viable and valuable report because he felt that it was so filled with wild speculation about prominent business leaders that it was potentially libelous. The nature of this wild speculation was that millionaire businessmen in Columbus and Youngstown were linked to the mob-style murder. Though Jackson's efforts were meant to keep this libelous report far from public view, it was eventually obtained by Bob Fitrakis, attorney, journalist, and executive director of the Columbus Institute for Contemporary Journalism, after he was accidentally sent a copy of the report in 1998 as a part of a public records request. The report, titled Shapiro Homicide Investigation, Analysis and Hypothesis, named Leslie Wexner as linked with associates reputed to be organized crime figures, and also lists the name of businessmen Jack Kessler, former Columbus City Council president, and Wexner associate Jerry Hammond, and former Columbus City Council member Les Wright as also being involved in Shapiro's murder. The report also noted that Arthur Shapiro's law firm, Schwartz Shapiro Kelman Warren, represented Wexner's company, The Limited, and states that prior to his death, Arthur Shapiro managed this account, The Limited, for the law firm. It also notes that at the time of his death, Shapiro was the subject of an investigation by the Internal Revenue Service because he had failed to file income tax returns for 7 years prior to his death, and he had invested in some questionable tax shelters. It also stated that his death prevented Shapiro from his planned testimony at a grand jury hearing about these questionable tax shelters. As to Wexner's alleged links to organized crime, the report focuses on the close business relationship between Wexner's The Limited and Francis Walsh, whose trucking company had done in excess of 90% of the Limited's trucking business around this time of Shapiro's murder, according to the report. Walsh was also named in 1998 as a co-conspirator of Genovese crime family boss Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, whose longtime lawyer was Roy Cohn. And the Shapiro murder report stated that Walsh was still considered associates of Genovese LaRocca family, and Walsh was still providing truck transportation for the Limited. Notably, the Genovese crime family has long formed a key part of the National Crime Syndicate, as its former head, Charles Lucky Luciano, co-created the criminal organization with his close friend Meyer Lansky. Upon Luciano's imprisonment and subsequent deportation from the United States, Lansky took over the syndicate's U.S. operations, and his association with Luciano's successors continued until Lansky's death in 1983. The Mega Mystery and the Mossad. In May 1997, the Washington Post broke an explosive story, a long since forgotten, based on an intercepted phone call made between a Mossad official in the U.S. and his superior in Tel Aviv that discussed the Mossad's efforts to obtain a secret U.S. government document. According to the Post, the Mossad official stated during the phone call that Israeli ambassador Ben Elazar had asked him whether he could obtain a copy of the letter given to Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat by then Secretary of State Christopher Warren on January 16th, the day after the Hebron Accord was signed by Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The Post article continued. According to a source who viewed a copy of the NSA transcript of the conversation, the intelligence officer, speaking in Hebrew, said, "The ambassador wants me to go to Mega to get a copy of this letter." The source said that the supervisor in Tel Aviv rejected the request, saying, "This is not something we use Mega for." Wow. Wow, 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 guys and girls and everybody else. Wow, 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 wow. Right there in that Post article, it proves to you that the Mega Group used intelligence for their own purposes. Wow. The leaked communication led to an investigation that sought to identify an individual codenamed Mega that the Post said may be someone in the U.S. government who has provided information to the Israelis in the past. A concern that subsequently spawned a fruitless FBI investigation. The Mossad later claimed that Mega was merely a code word for the U.S. CIA, but the FBI and the NSA were unconvinced by that claim and believed that it was a senior U.S. government official that had potentially once been involved in working with James Pollard, the former U.S. naval intelligence analyst, later convicted of spying for the Mossad. Okay, obviously it was the Mega Group. And it wasn't one person, it was several people, and what they were saying is they can go to these people in high places to get themselves some power. Get themselves a little influence and some information. Almost 1 year to the day after the Mega spy scandal broke, the Wall Street Journal was the first outlet to report on the existence of a little-known organization of billionaires that was informally called the Mega Group and had been founded years prior in 1991. The report made no mention of the spy scandal and had spread concerns of Israeli espionage in the U.S. only a year prior. However, the group's distinctive informal name and the connections of its members to the Mossad and to high-ranking Israeli politicians, including prime ministers, raised the possibility that Mega was not an individual as the FBI and NSA had believed, but a group. In 1997, when the Mega spy scandal broke, Netanyahu had recently become Prime Minister of Israel after an upset victory, a victory that was largely credited to one well-connected Netanyahu backer in particular, Ronald Lauder. Beyond being a major donor, Lauder had brought Arthur Finkelstein on to work for Netanyahu's 1996 campaign, whose strategies were credited for Netanyahu's surprise win. Netanyahu was close enough to Lauder that he personally enlisted Lauder and George Nader to serve as his peace envoys to Syria. Nader, who was connected to the Trump 2016 campaign and Trump ally and Blackwater founder Eric Prince, was recently hit with federal child sex trafficking charges last month, soon after Jeffrey Epstein had been arrested on similar charges. All right, pause. Nader was involved in the scam to try and bring Trump down. I don't really agree that he was a Trump ally. I think that's a little bit of stretching it there. And like I said, I call him how I see him. Most of Whitney Webb's work is really good, but I think she has a little bit of a bias against Trump, and that's fine. That's okay. She's allowed to have that bias. There's reasons for that. Her research has led her to certain points. But when certain issues, I have to stop and let you guys know that I don't believe that that's the case. You know, I've done the research there, and it's strenuous ties at best. At the time Nader was picked to work with Lauder on Netanyahu's behalf, he had already been caught possessing large amounts of child pornography on two separate occasions, first in 1984 and later in 1990. This strong connection between Netanyahu and Lauder during the time of 1997 mega spy scandal is important considering the Mossad directly answers to Israel's prime minister. Another possible connection between the mega group and the Mossad owes to the mega group's ties to Meyer Lansky's criminal network. As was detailed in Part 1, Lansky had established deep ties to U.S. intelligence after World War II and was also connected to the Mossad through Mossad's official Tibor Rosenbaum, whose bank was frequently used by Lansky to launder money. In addition, Lansky collaborated on at least one occasion with notorious Mossad super spy Rafi Eitan, who he helped acquire sensitive electronic equipment possessed only by the CIA but coveted by Israeli intelligence. Eitan is best known in the U.S. for being the Mossad handler of Jonathan Pollard. All right, so this goes back to what I've talked about previously. Israel is one of our best allies. There's no doubt about it. But if anyone doesn't think that they're playing games here, they're wrong, because Israel is doing the same thing everybody else is doing. They're trying to cultivate information. And what they were doing here, obviously, with Epstein and some other people, is they're in self-preservation mode, and they will do anything to make sure that they survive. Notably, Eitan was the main source of claims that the code word Mega used by the Mossad officials in 1997 referred to the CIA and not to a potential source in the U.S. government once linked to Pollard's spying activities, making his claims as to the true meaning of the term somewhat dubious. Given that the organized crime network tied to the Mega Group had ties to both U.S. and Israeli intelligence, the Mega code word could plausibly have referred to this secretive group of billionaires. More supporting evidence for this theory comes from the fact that prominent members of the Mega Group were business partners of Mossad agents, including media mogul and Robert Maxwell and commodities trader Mark Rich. The mysterious Maxwells. The Maxwell family has become a source of renewed media interest following Jeffrey Epstein's arrest, as Ghislaine Maxwell, long described in the media as a British socialite, was publicly cited as Epstein's longtime on and off girlfriend, and Epstein's victims, as well as former wives of Epstein's friends, have claimed that she was Epstein's pimp and procured underage girls for his sexual blackmail operations. Ghislaine Maxwell is also alleged to have engaged in the rape of the girls she procured for Epstein and to have used them to produce child pornography. Ghislaine was the favorite and youngest daughter of media mogul Robert Maxwell. Maxwell, born Jan Ludwig Hawk, had joined the British Army in World War II. Afterwards, according to authors John Loftus and Mark Ahrens, he greatly influenced the Czechoslovakian government's decision to arm Zionist paramilitaries during the 1948 war that resulted in Israel's creation as a state. And Maxwell himself was also involved in the smuggling of aircraft parts to Israel. Around this time, Maxwell was approached by British intelligence outfit MI6 and offered a position that Maxwell ultimately declined. MI6 then classified him as a Zionist, loyal only to Israel, and made him a person of interest. He later became an agent of the Mossad, according to several books, including Robert Maxwell, Israel's Super Spy by Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon. Furthermore, Seymour Hersh's The Samson Option, Israel's Nuclear Arsenal, and American Foreign Policy alleges ties between Maxwell and Israeli intelligence. According to Viktor Ostrovsky, a former Mossad case officer, Mossad was financing many of its operations in Europe from money stolen from Maxwell's newspaper pension fund. They got their hands on the fund almost as soon as Maxwell made the purchase of the Mirror newspaper group with money lent to him by Mossad. In exchange for his services, the Mossad helped Maxwell satisfy his sexual appetite during his visits to Israel, providing him with prostitutes, the service maintained for blackmail purposes. It was later revealed that the hotel in which he stayed in Israel was bugged with cameras, allowing the Mossad to acquire a small library of video footage of Maxwell in sexually compromising positions. As with the CIA, the Mossad's use of blackmail against both friend and foe is well documented and known to be extensive. We all know that. I've brought that up many times on the show. It's not even debatable at this point. It's much more of a fact than Hillary Clinton's conspiracy theory about Tulsi Gabbard being a Russian agent. Maxwell was also a close associate and friend of Israeli super spy Rafi Eitan, who, as previously mentioned, was Jonathan Pollard's handler and who had previously worked directly with Meyer Lansky. Eitan had learned of a revolutionary new software being used by the U.S. government known as PROMIS from Earl Bryan, a longtime associate and aide to Ronald Reagan. PROMIS is often considered the forerunner to the PRISM software used by spy agencies today and was developed by William Hamilton, who leased the software to the United States government through his company Inslaw in 1982. According to the author and former BBC investigative journalist Gordon Thomas, Bryan was angry that the U.S. Department of Justice was successfully using PROMIS to go after organized crime and money laundering activities, and Eitan felt that the program could aid Israel. At the time, Eitan was the director of the now-defunct Israeli military intelligence agency Lakam, which gathered scientific and technical intelligence abroad from both public and covert sources, especially in relation to Israel's nuclear weapons program. Okay, now, why did Epstein donate all that money to all these scientific programs? Why was he trying to get dirt on all these scientists? Well, you have your answers now. If you're a logical person and you've been following the podcast, you can lead back to right here where we're talking about, right here, this one paragraph, and it tells you everything you need to know. A plan was hatched to install a trapdoor into the software and then market PROMIS throughout the world, providing the Mossad with invaluable intelligence on the operations of its enemies and allies, while also providing Eitan and Brian with copious amounts of cash. According to the testimony of ex-Mossad official Ari Ben-Menashe, Brian provided a copy of PROMIS to Israel's military intelligence, which contacted an Israeli-American programmer living in California, who then planted the trapdoor in the software. The CIA was later said to have installed its own trapdoor in the software, but it is unknown if they did so with a version of the already bugged software and how widely it was adopted relative to the version bugged by Israeli intelligence. After the trapdoor was inserted, the problem became selling the bugged version of the software to governments as well as private companies around the world, particularly in areas of interest. Brian first attempted to buy out Inslaw and PROMIS and then used that same company to sell the bugged version. Unsuccessful, Brian turned to his close friend, then Attorney General Ed Meese, whose Justice Department then abruptly refused to make the payments to Inslaw that were stipulated by the contract, essentially using the software for free, which Inslaw claimed to be theft. Some have speculated that Meese's role in the decision was shaped not only by his friendship with Brian, but the fact that his wife was a major investor in Brian's business ventures. Meese would later become an advisor to Donald Trump when he was president-elect. Inslaw was forced to declare bankruptcy as a result of Meese's actions and sued the Justice Department. The court later found that the Meese-led department stole the software through trickery, fraud, and deceit. With Inslaw out of the way, Brian sold the software all over the world. Eitan later recruited Robert Maxwell to become another PROMIS salesman, which he did remarkably well, even succeeding in selling software to Soviet intelligence and conspiring with Republican Texas Senator John Tower to have the software adopted by the U.S. government laboratory at Los Alamos. Dozens of countries use the software on their most carefully guarded computer systems, unaware that Mossad now had access to everything PROMIS touched. Whereas Mossad's past reliance on gathering intelligence had relied on the same tactics used by its equivalents in the U.S. and elsewhere, the widespread adoption of the PROMIS software, largely through the actions of Earl Brian and Robert Maxwell, gave the Mossad a way to gather not just troves of counterintelligence data, but also blackmail on other intelligence agencies and powerful figures. Indeed, PROMIS's backdoor and adoption by intelligence agencies all over the world essentially provided the Mossad with access to troves of blackmail that the CIA and FBI had acquired on their friends and foes for over half a century. Strangely, in recent years, the FBI has sought to hide information related to Robert Maxwell's connection to the PROMIS scandal. According to journalist Robert Fisk, Maxwell was also involved in the Mossad abduction of Israeli nuclear weapons whistleblower Vanu Mordecai. Mordecai had attempted to provide the media with information on the extent of Israel's nuclear weapons program, which was eventually published by the Sunday Times of London. Yet Mordecai had also contacted the Daily Mirror with information, the Mirror being an outlet that was owned by Maxwell and whose foreign editor was a close Maxwell associate and alleged Mossad asset, Nicholas Davies. Journalist Seymour Hersh alleged that Davies had also been involved in Israeli arms sales. Per Fisk, it was Maxwell who contacted the Israeli embassy in London and told them of Mordecai's activities. This led to Mordecai's entrapment by a female Mossad agent who seduced him as part of a honey trap operation that led to his kidnapping and later imprisonment in Israel. Mordecai served an 18-year sentence, 12 of which were in solitary confinement. Then there is the issue of Maxwell's death, widely cited by mainstream media and independent media alike as a suspicious and potential homicide. According to authors Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon, Maxwell had sealed his own fate when he attempted to threaten top Mossad officials with the exposure of certain operations if they did not help him rescue his media empire from crippling debt and financial difficulties. Many of Maxwell's creditors, who had grown increasingly displeased with the media mogul, were Israeli, and several of them were alleged to be Mossad-connected themselves. Thomas and Dylan argue in their biography of Maxwell's life that the Mossad felt that Maxwell had become more of a liability than an asset and killed him on his yacht 3 months after he demanded the bailout. On the other extreme are theories that suggest Maxwell committed suicide because of the financial difficulties of his empire's failure. Some have taken Maxwell's funeral held in Israel as the country's official confirmation of Maxwell's service to the Mossad, as it was likened to a state funeral and attended by no less than 6 serving and former heads of Israeli intelligence. During his funeral service in Jerusalem, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir eulogized him and stated, "He has done more for Israel than can today be said." Other eulogies were given by future Prime Ministers Ehud Olmert, then Health Minister, and Shimon Peres, with the latter also praising Maxwell's services on behalf of Israel. Swimming in the same swamp. As he built his business empire and he even became a member of parliament, Maxwell was doing work for Israeli intelligence as several of the Israeli companies in which he invested became fronts for the Mossad. In addition, he became a media mogul. He developed a bitter rivalry with Rupert Murdoch, a close friend of Roy Cohn and an influential figure in American British media. Maxwell also partnered with the Bronfman brothers, Edgar and Charles, key figures in the mega group. In 1989, Maxwell and Charles Bronfman partnered up to bid on the Jerusalem Post newspaper, and the Post described the two men as two of the world's leading Jewish financiers, and their interest in the venture as developing the Jerusalem Post and expanding its influence among world Jewry. A year prior, Maxwell and Bronfman had become top shareholders in the Israeli pharmaceutical company, Teva. Maxwell also worked with Charles Bronfman's brother Edgar in the late 1980s to convince the Soviet Union to allow Soviet Jews to immigrate to Israel. Edgar's efforts in this regard have received more attention, as it was a defining moment of his decades-long presidency of the World Jewish Congress, of which Ronald Lauder is currently president. Yet Maxwell had also made considerable use of his contacts in the Soviet government in this effort. Maxwell also moved in the circles of the network previously described in parts 1 and 2 in this series. A key example of this is May 1989 party Maxwell hosted on his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, named for his youngest daughter and Epstein's future girlfriend. Attendees of the party included Roy Cohn's protege Donald Trump and his longtime law partner Tom Bolin. A close friend of Nancy Reagan was also present, journalist Mike Wallace, as was literary agent Mort Janklow, who represented Ronald Reagan, and two of Cohn's closest friends, journalists William Safire and Barbara Walters. The CEO of what would soon become Time Warner, Steve Ross, was also invited to the exclusive event. Ross's presence is notable as he had built his business empire largely through his association with New York crime lords Manny Kimmel and Abner Longy Zwillman. Zwillman was a close friend of Meyer Lansky, Michael Steinhardt's father, and Sam Bronfman, father of Edgar and Charles Bronfman. Another attendee of the Maxwell Yacht Party was former Secretary of the Navy and former Henry Kissinger staffer John Lehman, who would go on to associate with the controversial neoconservative think tank Project for a New American Century. Prior to being Secretary of the Navy, Lehman had been president of Abington Corporation, which hired arch neocon Richard Pearl to manage the portfolio of Israeli arms dealer Shlomo Zabludowicz and his son Chaim, who paid Abington $10,000 a month. A scandal arose when those payments continued after both Lehman and Pearl joined the Reagan Department of Defense, and while Pearl was working to persuade the Pentagon to buy arms from companies linked to Zabludowicz. Pearl had been part of the Reagan transition team along with Roy Cohn's longtime friend and law partner, Tom Bolin, another Maxwell yacht guest. In addition to Lehman, another former Kissinger staff, Thomas Pickering, was present at Maxwell's yacht party. Pickering played a minor role in the Iran-Contra affair, and at the time of the Maxwell Yacht Party, he was U.S. ambassador to Israel. Senator John Tower, who allegedly conspired with Maxwell and the Mossad-bugged PROMIS software at the Los Alamos Laboratories, was also present. Tower died just months before Maxwell in a suspicious plane crash. Ghislaine Maxwell was also at this rather notable event. After her father's mysterious death and alleged murder on the same yacht that bears her name in 1991, she quickly packed her bags and moved to New York City. There she soon made the acquaintance of Jeffrey Epstein, and a few years later developed close ties to the Clinton family, which will be discussed in the next installment of this series. Jeffrey Epstein and the New Promise. After it was revealed that Epstein had evaded stricter sentencing in 2008 due to his links to intelligence, it was the Mossad's ties to Ghislaine Maxwell's father that have led many to speculate that Epstein's sexual blackmail operation was sharing incriminating information with the Mossad. Former CBS executive producer and current journalist for the media outlet Narrative, Zev Shalev, has since claimed that he independently confirmed that Epstein was tied directly to the Mossad. Epstein was a longtime friend of former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who has long-standing and deep ties to Israel's intelligence community. Their decades-long friendship has been the source of recent political attacks targeting Barak, who is running in the Israeli elections against current Prime Minister Netanyahu later this year. Barak is also close to Epstein's chief patron and megagroup member Leslie Wexner, whose Wexner Foundation gave Barak $2 million in 2004 for a still unspecified research program. According to Barak, he was first introduced to Epstein by former Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres, who eulogized Robert Maxwell at his funeral and had decades-long ties with the Bronfman family going back to the early 50s. Peres was also a frequent participant in programs funded by Leslie Wexner in Israel and worked closely with the Mossad for decades. In 2015, a few years after Epstein's release from prison following his conviction for soliciting sex from a minor in 2008, Barak formed a company with Epstein, with the chief purpose of investing in Israeli startup then known as Reporty. That company, now called Carbine, sells its signature software to 911 call centers and emergency service providers and is also available to consumers as an app that provides emergency services with access to a caller's camera and location and also runs any caller's identity through any linked government database. It has specifically been marked by the company itself and the Israeli press as a solution to mass shootings in the United States and is already being used by at least 2 U.S. counties. Wow. Count me out on that. I don't need any software to help me out with anything like that. I mean, are you kidding me right now? Israeli media reported that Epstein and Barak were among the company's largest investors. Barak poured millions into the company, and it was recently revealed by Haaretz that a significant amount of Barak's total investments in Carbine was funded by Epstein, making him a de facto partner in the company. Barak is now Carbine's chairman. The company's executive team are all former members of different branches of Israeli intelligence, including the elite military intelligence unit, Unit 8200, that is often likened to Israel's equivalent of the U.S. National Security Agency. Carbine's current CEO, Amir Elakai, served in Unit 8200 and tapped former Unit 8200 commander Pinchas Bukris to serve as the company's director on its board. In addition to Elakai, another Carbine co-founder, Litel Leshem, also served in Unit 8200 and later worked for Israeli private spy company Black Cube. Leshem now works for a subsidiary of Eric Prince's company Frontier Services Group, according to the independent media outlet Narrative. The company also includes several tie-ins to the Trump administration, including Palantir founder and Trump ally Peter Thiel, an investor in Carbine. In addition, Carbine. In Carbine's board of advisors include former Palantir employees Trey Stevens, who was a member of the Trump transition team, as well as former Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff. Trump donor and New York real estate developer Elliot Tawil is also on Carbine's board, alongside Ehud Barak and Pinchas Bukris. Narrative, which wrote the first expose on Carbine after Epstein's arrest, noted that the Chinese government uses a smartphone app very similar to Carbine as part of its massive surveillance apparatus, even though the original purpose of the app was for improved emergency reporting. According to Narrative, the Chinese Carbine equivalent monitors every aspect of a user's life, including personal conversations, power usage, and tracks a user's movement. Yeah, like I said, count me out of anything like that. Are you kidding me right now? It's bad enough them listening to us with Alexa and the other nonsense on our phones. They're going to have this new software going on? No way. Given the history of Robert Maxwell, the father of Epstein's longtime girlfriend and young girl procuring madam Ghislaine Maxwell, in promoting the sale of Carbine's modified Promise software, which was also marketed as a tool to improve government efficacy, but was actually a tool of mass surveillance for the benefit of Israeli intelligence. The overlap between Carbine and Promise is troubling and warrants further investigation. It is also worth noting that Unit 8200 connected tech startups after being widely integrated into U.S. companies and have developed close ties to the U.S. military-industrial complex, with Carbine being just one example of that trend. As Mint Press previously reported, Unit 8200 linked outfits like Team 8 have recently hired former National Security Agency Director Mike Rogers as a senior advisor and gained prominent Silicon Valley figures, including former Google CEO Eric Schmidt, as key investors. Many American technology companies, from Intel to Google to Microsoft, have merged with several Unit 8200 connected startups in recent years and have been moving many key jobs and operations to Israel with the backing from key Republican donors like Paul Singer. Many of these same companies, in particular Google and Microsoft, are also major U.S. government contractors. Who is Epstein really working for? Even though Jeffrey Epstein appears to have had ties to the Mossad, this series has revealed that the networks to which Epstein has connected were not Mossad exclusive, as many of the individuals close to Epstein, Leslie Wexner for instance, were part of mob-connected class of oligarchs with deep ties to both the U.S. and Israel. As we discussed in part 1 of this series, the sharing of intelligence, i.e. blackmail, between intelligence agencies and the same organized crime network connected to the megagroup goes back decades, with Leslie Wexner of the megagroup as Epstein's chief patron as opposed to a financier with direct ties to the Mossad. A similar relationship is more than likely in the case of the sexual blackmail operation that Epstein ran. Bingo, bango, boongo, point blank for you guys. This is what I've been talking about. Given that intelligence agencies in both the U.S. and elsewhere are often conduct covert operations for the benefit of oligarchs and large corporations as opposed to national security interests, Epstein's ties to the megagroup suggest that this group holds a unique status and influence in both the governments of the U.S. and of Israel, as well as in other countries that were not explored in this report. This is by virtue of their role as key political donors in both countries, as well as the fact that several of them own powerful companies or financial institutions in both countries. Indeed, many members of the megagroup have deep ties to Israel's political class, including to Netanyahu and Ehud Barak, as well as to now deceased figures like Shimon Peres, and to members of the American political class. Ultimately, the picture painted by the evidence is not a direct tie to a single intelligence agency, but a web linking key members of the megagroup, politicians, and officials in both the U.S. and Israel, and an organized crime network with deep business and intelligence ties in both nations. Though this series has so far focused on the ties of this network to main Republican Party affiliates, the next and final installment will reveal the ties developed between this web and the Clintons. As will be revealed, despite the Clintons' willingness to embrace corrupt dealings during the span of their political careers, their mostly friendly relationship with this network still saw them use the power of sexual blackmail to obtain certain policy decisions that were favorable to their personal and financial interests, but not to the Clintons' political reputation or agendas. Wow. So, there you guys have it. I'm going to let you guys unpack that for yourselves. There's a lot there. And like I said, I went through and I vetted this as best as I could, and she's spot on. Her information is spot on, folks. She knows what she's talking about. She is locked in on this case. She deserves to be listened to, and I'm going to reach out to her, and maybe I can get her to come on to the podcast. Maybe she wants to come on and talk to you guys. I hope so. So anyway, this was episode 1 of A Closer Look, a new segment that I'm going to be starting once a week. And next week, we'll do part 2 of her article that ties the Clintons into all of this. And we'll keep it going. I hope that you guys enjoyed your weekend. I hope that everybody had a fun time. Hope everybody's ready for Monday morning tomorrow. And I'll be back with you guys tomorrow for another daily.